I'll be one of those who will be participating at the discussions in the United Nations, which has been called for by the Secretary General. In discussing these issues with some of my officials here, I had to raise a few questions which I thought I will also place before you. Where do we go from here? We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which you all accepted, and now we are evaluating the results halfway through. But the world has changed a lot since then. Addition to the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Paris Climate Summit, we had the Glasgow Summit, and therefore the whole issue of climate change. In addition, we are also meeting after the adverse impact of COVID-19 throughout the world. Sri Lanka was one of the worst affected because COVID itself resulted in Sri Lanka becoming bankrupt. But every country has suffered. There has been a big setback to the global economy. Even if we look at it today, what do we see the progress? In Europe, it's still stagnant. US has been luckier with growth taking place and the on and off rise and the lowering of the economic performance. China has still to recover. So the growth engines of the world has stopped. Now what is the cost of all this to us? How do we find the financial resource for the sustainable development goals? How do we find the financial resources for climate change mitigation? How do you find the financial resources for the global debt financing crisis? The engine itself, the engine of growth itself is still not come to its fullest. It's in crisis. And with this engine of growth, we have also got to find in crisis, we've got to find the resources both for the sustainable development goals and for climate change. I am not talking against it. These are goals which we have to fulfill. And we have our commitments from the SDGs of 2030 to climate change goals of 2050. Recently, the Secretary General called for an accelerated agenda. But all this requires your ability to find the resources. Some thought that the developed world will be good enough with the funding. They are not. They certainly haven't come up with the resources. And at the moment, I don't think they have the resources, looking at the problem they are facing. Then where do we find it? Is the world still ready for a period of fast growth? No. We are in the middle of a crisis, another crisis. So first we've got to look at, how do we find the resources? What are the resources available? We rely not only on financing from the multilateral development banks, but also from the private sector. Private sector to invest, the private sector to issue bonds. Now, will that succeed in the case of many countries? Some may not be prepared to accept it. The private sector will find the others still are not suitable for investments. So we leave about 1/3 to 40% out of that. Then how is the rest to grow? Now I think this is an issue which we have to face. Where do we find the funding? And look at Sri Lanka. We required annual investment of 9% of the GDP in 2019. This is just to attain the SDGs. In addition to it, now for the climate change goals, and we are a country that's bankrupt. So where do we find the resources? Now this is a question mark that all of us have. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, we will make the best effort. And as a result of the debt crisis we've had, we would look forward. We are now taking measures to restructure the economy completely, to go follow the path that Thailand did, that Indonesia did, that Vietnam did, so that we become a highly competitive economy, and we have to learn to find our markets. We can no longer be what we were earlier, a small economy that is protected. So I hope that we will succeed in it. But it means reworking, starting from the beginning. We have to put money in to the new technologies. We have to bring in foreign investment and capital. But this is what we want to do. Because if we can develop on our own, that is less resources needed for Sri Lanka and more resources available elsewhere. So let's not be a burden. I think we in Sri Lanka should no longer think of asking others for help, but let's make it on our own. Many countries have done. Take Vietnam, completely destroyed by a war, which was still able to become a world power. So there are many growing economies. So there are many instances, and we are living in an area of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, where in East Asia, Southeast Asia, you see growth taking place, and India with the potential for growth, and the Indian Ocean region, which will be the next area of growth. So on our own, we'll try to make it. But can the whole world thereafter even? Okay, Sri Lanka, part of the Sri Lankan costs are taken by the Sri Lankans. It doesn't mean that there will be so much more resources available for the others. So since we have 3 different programs which need to be addressed, should we not look at an integrated approach on how we are to resolve this? What are the areas in which we will give emphasis and priority? What are the areas that we will follow, which can take place later? So I think it's time for all of us to review this, and to review the SDGs, to review the climate change mitigation, to look at the global debt crisis, not to abandon any of it, not to abandon the goals, but bring them together and then see how we can regroup ourselves for the next phase. As I use the word regroup intentionally, because when you go to battle and after some period, when your numbers are spread out, then you get them all together and you regroup for the next assault. So we have to do the next assault, but let's regroup, re-strategize, and go ahead.